Well, oh, gotta get my headphones on. Oh, oh my. You ever have one of those kind of days where you forget to put your headphones on and other things? Hey, welcome back to another episode of Sex, Addiction, and the Missing Piece. And my name is Ken Donaldson. I'm your host. And today I'm I'm really concerned that, well, I'm concerned I might bore you today. So I'm going to be upfront about it because I'm going to share with you some information about research. And I know not everybody is into research, but if you really want to look at a topic and you want to study a topic and you want to provide information on a topic, it's really important to not only have research, but have what we would call legitimate research, which is research that's valid and reliable, research that's been shown to replicate results and also is shown to measure what it says it measures, essentially. So I want to share with you a little bit about research and some of the research that I've discovered in this arena of sexual addiction. It's really interesting. I think you'll find the breadth of it interesting. However, I hope I don't bore you with the actual research part of it. Okay. So fair warning, those of you that aren't into research, you might want to wait until the next episode. And by the way, I appreciate all the comments from the last episode. A lot of great ideas, a lot of positive reinforcement. Keep them coming. I'm trying to keep up with you all. I'm taking notes. The list of episodes is growing every day as far as different directions that we can go to provide information to help you and help clinicians and help people who are struggling with this sexual addiction dilemma. It's quite a dilemma because there's a lot of controversy over what it is, what to call it, how to treat it, and things of that nature. So without any further ado, I have a stack here that I'm going to pull from. And a friend of mine mentioned, like, I'm not doing this to show off. Okay. I'm just trying to do this to share. He said, don't show off that you've got, 80 pieces of research. That makes it too much about you. I'm not trying to make it about me, but the research speaks for itself. So this big thick piece here, this is, oh gosh, it's about 150 pages long, was just published in December 2020. So it just came out, very recent. It's what's called a meta-analysis. And if you're not familiar with meta-analysis, that's basically an analysis of the analysis. So that's research on the research that's been done. So they collected a lot of pieces of research, actually 371 pieces of research, and they correlated them to see what the results were when they were all correlated. So one of the things that's interesting, as I mentioned, there's 371 pieces of research that they touch on in this. And this is over the last 25 years. So it's from 1995 through 2020. So one of the things that was really interesting was that they discovered that between 95 and 2004, there were only 25 papers, research papers. Now, when I say research papers, these are research that has empirical evidence in it. So things that are not just somebody's opinion, but they actually have done research on people and gotten results. So from 95 to 2004, there was a total of 25 papers that were published around the topic of sexual addiction. Between 2005 to 2014, there were 119 papers that were published about sexual addiction. So that almost 5 times as many in that second 10 years. And between 2015 and 2020, just 5 years, there were 227 papers published about sexual addiction. So what does that say? That tells us that this topic is getting a lot of attention. It's becoming more and more in the conversation, in almost the mainstream, but particularly in the realms of sexology, psychology, addictionology. We're really beginning to address, which is good news. It's really good news, really beginning to address sexual addiction in a way that, again, is not just based on opinions, that's based on research. And I'm actually going to spend an episode going through some of the results from this specifically. I just got to translate it into easy to understand language so I don't really bore you to death. Okay, so there's one big piece there. Okay, there's one piece I found, one piece of research that's it's about the treatment of sexual addiction using what's called experiential therapy. Okay, so experiential therapy is different than the traditional talk therapy. Talk therapy is, we use a lot of different kinds of like psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral. Um, it's typical talk therapy. Experiential therapy is when you actually have people doing things that they're experiencing. So they're moving. So, for example, art therapy, music therapy, any of the movement therapies, dance therapy, those are all experiential therapies. Drama therapy, psychodrama, those are experiential therapies. So, this was a piece of research that was done using only experiential therapy as a therapeutic modality for people who are struggling with sexual addiction. And the results they got were really amazing. And I'm also going to focus an episode of this podcast on this specifically. I'm actually hoping to get one of the authors of this to be a guest. It's somebody I've actually run into before, and I sort of kind of know him a little bit. So I'm hoping that he might find the time, energy, and willingness to do so. But really interesting results, very positive results. Unfortunately, experiential therapy is not something that we see used mainstream. Okay, so here's one on clinician competency in sexual addiction. Now, this is sort of interesting. It was something that I sort of accidentally found. And what's curious about it, and the reason that I decided to print it out and utilize it as part of this, is that there's a lot of questions, and it's really not a competency so much as it is an understanding that clinicians have, first of all, about addiction. I know I have a lot of colleagues that say, I don't work with addiction. And when I ask them why, it's basically because they have a hard time understanding it, or they have a reaction to it. They realize it's out of their wheelhouse, and that's a good thing. It's always good to realize what you're not good at and what you are good at, and stay in your own lane, so to speak. But this is focused on competency in treating sexual addiction, and some specific parameters that are really necessary in order for therapy to have a possibility of being successful. Really, some really interesting insights. There's another piece of research I found on, and this is about how people change. And the reason that this is interesting, and how it fits in with the sexual addiction conversation, is because there's a couple different models when it comes to addiction. We have what's called the disease model, which is probably the most commonly used model and the model that's taught the most. And then we have what's called the choice model. The difference is the disease model looks at addiction as being a disease. It's something that you have. You've always had it. You'll always have it. You've always had it. You have it, and you will always have it. The choice model looks at it as that these are choices that are made and you can make different choices, and therefore it's not something that you necessarily have your whole life. Really interesting, different kind of perspectives. And I think that when we look at sexual addiction, one of the things that's going to be really important is that we look at as many different angles as we can in how to address it, how to identify it, and how to treat it. So this is just sort of a comparison and contrast between models. I found one piece of research on the cultural dynamics about sexual addiction. And what I found really interesting about this is it's about the hookup culture. Okay. And I have to admit, the hookup culture, I'm a little bit older. I wasn't exactly sure what that was, but it's just the level of openness with sexuality is a little bit different today than it was, let's say 20, 30, 40 years ago. But what's really interesting is that I grew up, I remember the 60s, okay, and the Woodstock era. And if that wasn't a hookup culture back then, I don't know what was. So it's sort of interesting that it seems like life again has come full circle, but it looks at some interesting dynamics as it looks at sexual addiction versus just cultural norms, if you will, knowing that cultural norms change all the time. Now, this is a really big stack. This is 20 pieces of research, okay? And the reason that there's so many pieces here, these are all different pieces of research that have to do with the diagnosis of sexual addiction. And the reason that there's so much here, and there's actually a couple of other pieces I have that could also go in this pile, but I separated them for a reason. The reason there's so much here, and I've mentioned this before, is because there's so much controversy about sexual addiction. And the biggest question, the biggest controversy is what to call it. Okay. So for example, I'm referring to the term sexual addiction just because that's what I've always referred to it as. That's what it comes normal to me. Okay. My background is I'm an addictionologist for 34 years, and then I became a mental health professional. But there's, and they're actually an official diagnosis today that's called compulsive sexual behavior disorder. And that's an official diagnosis by the World Health Organization and the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. They referred to it in their previous edition as hypersexuality. There's some people call it sexual impulsivity. Some people call it sexual compulsivity. There's been some people that call it Don Juanism, and we still hear the term nymphomania every once in a while. So all these terms, out of control sexual behavior, that's another newer one. All of these labels, they have a certain amount of validity to them, and it's really interesting to read the research as to why they're using the models and the language that they are. But that also shows you just how much controversy there is in this, just with what to call it. Okay. Then I mentioned earlier, this is three specific pieces of research that have to do directly with the disease model of addiction. So again, that's the model that I learned under, and that's the model that most people learn under. I'm not saying it's like the right model. And I really, the more I research this, the more I realize that, the more we widen things out and get flexible and inclusive of several different models, probably the more effective we're going to be in being able to treat this, rather than getting into power struggles about a right way and a wrong way. But these three pieces of research are particularly about the disease model, and they really look at both sides of it. What's the pros and cons of that disease model? Is it helpful to refer to addiction as a disease, or is it counterproductive to do so? And there's research on both sides of that. This is 3 more papers on, has to do with diagnosis and sexual addiction. These are particularly, the reason I separated these from the other diagnosis, the other 20, is that these are specifically, they're like argument papers about the controversy of sexual addiction and what to call it. I found 2 pieces of research on what's called emotional regulation. I know that's sort of a clinical terminology, but looking at the correlation between how well people regulate their emotions, in other words, identify, express, cope with their emotions, and sexual addiction. And one of the things that shows up, and probably no big surprise, but the people who are more prone to sexual addiction have more difficulty with their emotional regulation. And that includes identifying what they're feeling, expressing them in an appropriate way, and then also manage them in a healthy kind of way. Here's another really big stack here. Okay, there's 9 pieces of research here. Now, this just happened to be an accidental discovery that I'm a little bit pleased about, to tell you the truth, but it wasn't something I anticipated finding. I kept looking for treatment models, treatment of sexual addiction, different kinds of treatment. And I kept finding these pieces of research that were using hypnosis or hypnotherapy, pretty much the same thing, using hypnotherapy in the treatment of sexual addiction. I'm a hypnotherapist. I've used hypnotherapy for years. It's actually the very first thing I was taught in way back when. So it's something that comes second nature to me. So when I saw this, I was really curious because I understand how hypnosis works. But I found 9 pieces of research that has to do specifically with using hypnotherapy in the treatment of sexual addiction. 4 papers here on the compulsive sexual behavior disorder, that specific diagnosis that the World Health Organization has chosen to use in their ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. And this is just, these are not all, I wouldn't call them research papers. Some of them are sort of showing the pros and cons of why we might want to use that terminology and why we might not. I found 1 piece of research, and there's a lot more on this, but the reason I grabbed this one is that this is actually a meta-analysis. And again, that's an analysis of analysis. That's looking at several different pieces of research. In fact, this was actually over 10 years. But specifically on internet pornography use, which falls under the umbrella of sexual addiction. But we're finding that the people that are just using internet porn or porn addiction, we oftentimes refer to it as, they have a little bit different dynamics than the typical, if you will, person struggling with sexual addiction. So this is a nice meta-analysis, a nice overview of 10 years of research that's been done in the world of pornography addiction. A couple other surprises. I found 2 pieces of research that have to do with using meditation as a primary treatment protocol for the treatment of sexual addiction. Wasn't really anticipating finding research that was done. I've read books that have suggested it, and I know a lot of clinicians that have used it, but this is actually some very solid research showing some very positive findings in the use of hypnotherapy and sexual addiction. There's 3 pieces, and I'm sure I'm going to find more on this. These have to do with the neuroscience of sexual addiction, and neuroscience is something that we're really just scratching the surface, even though it's a term that we've been throwing around for quite some time. But really looking at what's going on neurologically behind the scenes in the brain that seems to be enabling some of this addictive behavior, specifically in sexual behavior, sexual addiction. So 3 pieces of very solid research, some really interesting findings about some things that are unique to sexual addiction that are a little bit different than some of the other things that people can get addicted to. And then also some similarities. We find that, in fact, people who are struggling with sexual addiction, the parts of their brain that seem to light up are almost exactly the same as the parts of the brain that get lit up when people are actually doing cocaine. So there's a lot to be said about what's going on between our ears and the neurochemistry that gets created all by itself. We don't necessarily have to have a substance that gets it going. We can do it all on our own. This is one piece of research. It's called a cluster analysis. It's, again, sort of like a meta-analysis. Is looking at a lot of different pieces, and it's really looking at the occurrence of sexual addiction. What's the percentage of people that actually are struggling with sexual addiction? So how frequent is it? A couple of pieces of research here on personality types in sexual addiction. We've talked a lot about there's addictive personality. You've probably heard that kind of language, and there's actually some question marks about whether that's really accurate or not. But this really looks at, again, from a research model, personality dynamics and some of the correlations with personality types and sexual addiction. I found one piece. I've got to do some more research, but there wasn't much. And this is all about preventing sexual addiction. It was a little bit disappointing because I was hoping to find more. And part of the reason I'm engaged in this and doing this research is that I really want to be more involved on the proactive part of this. Like, how can we prevent this from even happening? And I'll talk a lot more about that in future episodes. But I did find one piece of research that was specifically created about the prevention of sexual addiction. Here's 2 pieces of research I found on what would be called non-traditional recovery models. One's using Buddhism, and one's using a little bit different kind of model than is typically mainstream. Here's a couple pieces of research that are focused on sexual addiction and religion, or religious upbringing, the impact it has. I think there's probably going to be a lot more of this that we're going to be seeing because there seems to be more and more of a correlation between shame and sexual addiction. A lot of the shame that we're finding is people get different kind of mixed messages about from their religious upbringing. And here is 7 pieces of research. I was quite pleased with this, that have to do with sex education and its effectiveness. And again, this is where the prevention comes in. This is the proactive model. And so really happy to see this. And there's some really, really great indicators here about some pretty basic, simple things that can be done that can help us to catch this before it even gets started. And then we don't have to argue as much about what to call it and how to classify it and how to treat it, because we won't have as much of it. I found 7 pieces of research that have to do with different kinds of treatment for sexual addiction. And this is really fascinating because there is such a broad variety of different treatment models. And again, this is one of these areas that there seems to be a bit of a power struggle in that people sort of want to own it, like, well, this is the way, not a way. And I think if we can all step back a little bit and look at all these different models, we can find that there's a model for different models for different people. So it is not a cookie cutter approach, is what I'm discovering. And now this is another huge stack here. And this is really curious. When I first started this research, when I first started looking, I was not expecting to discover this. So this was a very nice surprise, although it probably is not really very nice. But what it has to do is with media and the sex. And what I refer to as sexualization through the media. And so there's some really interesting pieces of research that have been done looking at the progression of how sex is used in the media in a lot of different ways. And that would be in advertising, and it would be in television, movies, magazines, all forms of media. So a real interesting variety of different results, and really curious about, I talked about this a little bit in the last episode, how there seems to be this influx of more using sex, or I call it this, the sexualization, and yet at the same time, no education per se, or a lack of education. So, and then the last stack, okay, I think there's a total of about 80 pieces here, maybe a couple more. This is 6 pieces of research that have to do specifically with 12-step programs and sexual addiction. And if you're not familiar with 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous was the first 12-step program. And so they use these 12 steps, and they have become very popular, very commonplace. I have had a lot of clients over the years that have gone to 12-step meetings. I've seen mixed reviews. For the most part, it seems like people who go and stay with it, it benefits them, it helps them. What's really interesting about the sexual addiction piece is that there are about 8 different types of 12-step programs that address sexual addiction. There's Sexaholics Anonymous, there's Sex Addicts Anonymous, there's Sex in Love Addicts Anonymous, there's Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, there's Sex and Recovery Anonymous, there's Pornography Addiction Anonymous, and Pornography Anonymous. So there's a lot of them, and it's interesting that there's so many, and they seem to be addressing sort of different little nuances under the big umbrella of sexual addiction. But that's it. That's all of the pieces of research. And so what I'm going to be doing in the future, like I said, I'm looking to hopefully get some guests on here, perhaps some other people that have contributed to some of these pieces of research, so we can have some conversation and get a better understanding about what this sexual addiction piece is all about. And once again, this is sex, addiction, and the missing piece. My name is Ken Donaldson, and I'm your host. I hope you stop back by, and as always, please continue to drop by with the questions and comments. Always love to hear from you. So thank you very much.